Okay, so this vodcast is about how to write a speech specifically for year 10 to 12 English students, although it should have some universal piece of instruction as well for anyone else who might like to use it. What we'll be going through in this vodcast is the structure of a speech. So some of the basic components, what goes first, what goes in the middle, what goes at the end, how to structure paragraphs, how to structure sentences, and then what a speech sounds like. So some of the features of voice and writing style, specifically because it'll be a written speech, although once it is written it can be spoken. And in that regard we'll be looking at Aristotelian means of rhetoric. So ethos refers to the character and credibility of the speaker, the person who is speaking. Logos refers to the use of logic or reason and argument, and is the message of the speech. So we'll be using words like contention and arguments. And then the pathos, so the emotional state of the audience, or when Aristotle refers to this, he means the speaker's use of techniques, use of rhetoric to evoke emotion in his audience and in specific audiences. I'm going to be moving through these things fairly quickly. So it's recommended that if you hit a point where you need to either revise what has been discussed or said, or you need to think about it a little bit more clearly, I recommend that you pause and do so. Trying not to repeat myself too much. What I will not be covering, but these are the things that students participating in this task will still need to consider. They are how to include references and ideas from source texts. This is particularly relevant to creating and presenting, where you'll be assigned one particular source text, and then you can use other extraneous ideas from that as well. You're going to need to think about in your speech how you're going to use the ideas from the source text, perhaps even some of the language from the source text. Will you be quoting explicitly, or will you be using the language implicitly? Will you be adopting similar styles to the speaker of your source text? There are a myriad of other ways that you can do that, and I'm sure your teachers will help you out in that regard. The other thing that you'll need to consider is how to address a specific target audience. So here, look, I've read far too many bad pieces of writing which are just targeted at the students' own classmates, and it's just so boring. It's just so boring, and it's lazy. So the core of this task is for you to be able to show off some of your writing skills, or hopefully all of your writing skills, so that you can be awarded the highest criteria. When you choose to speak to your classmates, you're really limiting your ability to write for different audiences and show off some of your cool writing skills. I'll give a small piece of advice there. When students are struggling with an audience, I think there's two really useful questions. One is, who really needs to hear the message of what I'm going to say? And the other one is, who is someone that you know who might like to hear this? So as specific as you can possibly be to nail it down to one person. And once you start to think about that particular person, then you can start to broaden that and describe a demographic. The next thing that you need to think about is your speech's context and purpose. I marked a piece of work the other day where a student had written in the voice of Vincent from Gattaca, and he was talking about what it means to be human, and it was profoundly contrived because I don't know anywhere where Vincent would be speaking to a crowd. I can't imagine that situation, and I can't imagine why he would be up in front of a crowd speaking to them. And the person's speech didn't even mention this, it just kind of started going on about the idea. So it's really important that you need to visualize an actual context for your piece. It should be something that should actually be able to be delivered in the real world, as well as having a real purpose, not just kind of standing up and going, this is what I think about the prompt, but what would, in that context, what would these people need to know? What is the reason for you giving that speech, or for your speaker giving that speech? I'm going to use a couple of examples. Now, in the general sense, when we want to know how to do anything well, when we want to know how to do anything well, we look at the best possible examples that we can find, and then we mimic the person or the thing that we are looking at, the example of excellence. So this is true for anything in life. If you want to know how to be a really good carpenter, then you go to the best carpenter and you mimic what that person does. If you want to know how to write short stories well, then you get really good short stories and you mimic. If you want to know how to do really good vodcasts, then you should probably look elsewhere. So we're going to look at speeches, and I'm drawing together some of the speeches that I hold in high regard, and that I've had recommended to me as well. And we're going to be looking at how these speeches are structured and the features of these speeches. So just a little bit of a background behind each. The first one here is a speech by Chief Joseph. He was fleeing the US Army because they wanted to put him in a reservation, and he didn't want to go, and so he took his people and fled, and fled a long way, and then eventually he had to surrender because he couldn't make it all the way to Canada. So that's his speech. I chose this one specifically because the language in this piece is not particularly sophisticated, and it's not complex, but it is incredibly powerful. The next one is the classic "We Shall Fight on the Beaches," which is Winston Churchill's speech near the beginning of the First World War, where he's trying to imbue a sense of purpose and pathos for the people of England. And this particular one. This one has a particularly beautiful use of ethos and pathos, of rhetoric. This one again, probably the most famous speech, maybe of all time. This is Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, and the poetry of this speech was the reason that I chose this one. This one is Elie Wiesel's Nobel Prize acceptance speech, and this was chosen not only because right at the moment we're doing his reflection or recount of his experiences in the Holocaust in Year 10, but also because of there's just a beautiful humility and gentleness to the way that he speaks. His experiences in the Holocaust enabled this to have quite a significant purpose as well. And lastly, we've got an Australian example, maybe or perhaps one of the most entertaining Australian politicians, Paul Keating, who was famed for his rhetoric. He shows that Aussies can do all right with this stuff as well. So we've got his Remembrance Day speech from 1933, where he commemorates the unknown soldier, or presents the tomb for the unknown soldier. Okay, on to structure. So opening is interesting. And what's interesting to notice with this one, this is the Wiesel Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech. Wiesel opens this in a way that isn't cliched. So what I think is interesting about these really good speeches is they do not start with good evening, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. They move beyond that into something more meaningful. So he says, it is with a profound sense of humility that I accept the honour you have chosen to bestow upon me. I know your choice transcends me. This both frightens and pleases me. So what's interesting here is that he actually acknowledges, first thing he acknowledges is his audience. So right here we've got an acknowledgement of his audience and then his attitude towards his audience. And the second thing we notice is the reason that he's speaking. So he talks about the honour that these people have chosen to bestow. So two things there. When you're constructing your speech, try to move beyond the banal, good evening, ladies and gents. Move towards perhaps an acknowledgement of your audience, who you're speaking to, an acknowledgement of the reason that you are speaking to them. We can see that here too in Martin Luther King's speech, where he says, I am happy to join with you today. So he's already put himself in amongst his audience, looking at African American rights in the US, or advocating for that, and then his purpose. So what will go down in history is the greatest demonstration for freedom. That is his purpose, his intent in speaking. Okay, so there's your opening. That's what you should mimic. Paragraphing is quite interesting. Please be reminded that a speech is not an essay. Teachers will tell you to use Teal for essays. They should not tell you, they probably won't tell you to use Teal for speeches. Good speeches, really good speeches, and that's what you're aiming at, simply just don't use Teal. There's no Teal to be found here. So paragraphs are not based on argument, then examples, then explanation, then a link. So what are they based on? Well, it's interesting to note that the original or the intended way that a speech is consumed is to hear it and perhaps also to see the person giving it. So we hear a speech, we don't necessarily read a speech. And when we do read a speech or a transcript of a speech, what you notice here, hopefully, is all of this white space. And this is because in speeches that we hear, there is often quite a lot of pause. The reason I think that there's quite a lot of pause is when we're reading something, we can go back over that information and reread it if we need to. But when we're listening to something, we can't re-listen to it. We might have this kind of recording device in our brains, which enables us to go over it, but the person's going to continue speaking, and we don't want to miss what they're going to say next. So you often find that in speeches, and test me out on this one, go and have a look at some of these speeches or listen to some of these speeches on YouTube, there will be quite a lot of pause. And significant parts of the speech are given their own paragraph. Notice this, I have a dream today. The only thing that's different, it's repetition of the I have a dream. The only thing that's different here is today, and then he repeats it again over here. So I have a dream today. That is given its own paragraph. We're meant to dwell on that particular phrase, and we're meant to listen to it. So as a representation of it on the screen, we need shorter paragraphs, generally shorter paragraphs, especially compared to an essay, and then very, very short paragraphs. Sometimes single sentence paragraphs. Okay, sentence structure. What you'll hopefully notice about this is the use of often single-claused sentences or simple sentences, and then in amongst it, and so we've got two clauses here because we've got a conjunction here, but this one is very, very short. This clause is very, very short, and then a single claused sentence with not a lot of qualification around it. And then we've got very simple sentences there with another conjunction. Still simple. And then in here we get something that's a little bit more complex, a little bit more flowing, so there's a little bit more length to it. And then right after that, back into the single claused simple sentences. So if we read this one as well, and what you'll notice about this longer sentence, so the first thing to notice is lots of shorter sentences, more shorter sentences than long sentences. The second thing to notice is when we do get a long sentence, we get a sentence like this. We do not know his age or his circumstances, whether he was from the city or the bush, what occupation he left to become a soldier, what religion, if he had a religion, if he was married or single. In these longer sentences, there's a very deliberate sense of rhythm that is used with it. And we can almost hear it being spoken as it is transcribed on the page. So with these longer ones, you want to imbue it with a rhythm which is conducive. And then you want to break that rhythm when you head into the next sentence, which is a shorter sentence. So varied sentence structures. We see that as well here, which is the Winston Churchill speech. So listen to the way this works. It's quite beautiful. I have myself full confidence that if all do their duty, if nothing is neglected, and if the best arrangements are made as they are being made, we shall prove ourselves once again able to defend our island home, to ride out the storm of war, and to outlive the menace of tyranny, if necessary for years, if necessary alone. There's quite a long sentence there, but quite beautifully rhythmic in the way that it is structured. And in the next sentence we get, at any rate, this is what we are going to try to do. And then short sentence, and then there's a short sentence. So longer sentence, used sparingly, followed by shorter sentences. Okay, so that's paragraphing and sentence structure. What about at the end? Interestingly, this is Wiesel's speech. It's probably most appropriate for an acceptance speech from the Nobel Prize, but he says thank you. So he concludes with a thank you. This is also a way that you can close your speech too, which is a simple thank you. This is interesting though. This is Churchill's speech again. And this is the way that he ends his speech. The last sentence is quite lengthy, but he concludes his speech with an invitation to action. So hopefully throughout the body of your speech, what you're doing is you're using pathos to stir the emotions of your audience. And you're building that and you're creating this climax of pathos, of emotion with your audience. You're getting them stirred up, you're getting them ready to act on that. And then right at the end of your speech, you give them something that they can do about it. So some kind of application for it. So here where Churchill is speaking to his fellow Englishmen in a very difficult, obviously a very difficult time, his commandment or declaration at the end, his appeal to his audience for a particular action is that they would not give up, that they would hold true, and that they would continue to fight. And there's a classic line here, we shall never surrender. It's beautiful. Okay, so that's another way to close your speech, to compel your audience to do something about what you've said. Okay, features. So these are the Aristotelian uses of rhetoric. For logos, we've already got some of the structures there, which is good, but we're going to look at the way logic is used in speeches. We're going to look at the way ethos is used in speeches, so that's about character. We're going to look at how emotion is built within the audience. Okay, ethos to start with. This is Wiesel's speech, his acceptance speech, And what's quite fascinating about this speech is he refers to something that he struggles with in the autobiographical novella Night, and that is he really, as one can understand, he really struggles in that text with whether or not he can still believe in a compassionate, merciful God. And yet here in the acceptance speech, he declares, yes, I have faith. And hearing that from someone who has gone through such a horrific experience adds a lot of weight to his ideas. We are much more empathetic or sympathetic to someone who declares something about what they understand about the world when they've had a significant experience or had a diversity of experience in that field. So when you speak, when you use your speaker, try and pick someone, first off, try and pick someone with credibility, and then try and draw on that credibility when you are talking about your topic, as Wiesel does here. Okay, and then we have the slightly altered version of it, where we have Winston Churchill calling on the ethos or appealing to the ethos of what it means to be a Brit. And he talks about the Knights of the Round Table. He talks about the Crusaders. I'm not quite sure if we look on that very positively today, but he talks about the character and the identity of his nation. So it's like an appeal to patriotism, but he's calling on that in an appeal to his fellow Englishmen. Okay, and lastly, for ethos, we have here the Martin Luther King speech, where he, near the start, he gives an anecdote where he refers to the Emancipation Proclamation. And as we know, this proclamation was delivered by Abraham Lincoln in 1863-ish, where Lincoln had fought for and had won the Negro or the African American population out of slavery. And so this is an appeal to a significant moment in the history of the American people. So he knows his audience and he's appealing to their sense of patriotism here. Okay, logic. It's really important to notice with logic, again, I'll say it again because it always bears repeating, that Teal doesn't work, so don't go with Teal. This is almost the full speech here from Chief Joseph. And you'll notice that it's one paragraph, it's in very simple language, and there are multiple arguments embedded within it. So the argument, his contention is related to the idea, this is why we should surrender. This is why I have led my people into surrender. And then he gives some reasons for it. So one of the first is, he says, I'm tired of fighting. That's the third sentence along. Very simple clause. And then he doesn't follow it up. He says, I'm tired of fighting. And then he gives another one. All these people around me are dying. And he follows that through and explains all the people who are dying. And then he talks about the children and how the children are suffering. So there's three arguments here. They're not all given equal weight. They're not all explained fully. And they're all, this is the most important point to note, they're all embedded within the rhetoric. So that's your goal as well. It is to find the best moment in your rhetoric to deliver your argument. It's not necessarily always at the start of a paragraph, although here's where it is at the start of the paragraph. We talked about the Emancipation Proclamation just a second ago. Now this paragraph here, all of that paragraph is an anecdote about when that was delivered. So 50 years ago, Emancipation Proclamation, he talks about it. He talks about what it was and what its significance was. There's no argument here yet. It's just telling a story. Just telling a story about something significant. And then in the first sentence of the next paragraph, he says, the Negro is still, emphasis on the word still, is still not free. And then he continues on and he does emphasize that argument. So it's interesting to note here that this whole paragraph contains no argument, is simply anecdote, and then leads into the next paragraph, which does provide the argument for it. Okay, moving on. Repetition. I don't know many speeches. I actually don't know any good speech, any well-regarded speech which doesn't use repetition. Repetition seems to be one of those key features of speeches. Sorry for the rhyme. So here we have Winston Churchill giving his more famous lines from this speech, where he says, he repeats the words "we shall," calling his audience into action. So he says, "We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and the oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall, we shall, we shall, we shall, we shall." And it's interesting to note what is and what isn't repeated specifically. He repeats the first two words in the clause, or in each of the clauses. He doesn't repeat individual words. He doesn't repeat keywords. He doesn't even repeat keywords. He repeats these first two words at the start of a clause: we shall. Inclusive language, and the start of a verbal clause, and that's what's repeated. So when you're using repetition, don't just use it willy-nilly. Don't just slap down a few key words of the same key word again and again. That's not using repetition for emotive appeal or an emotive appeal. It works well rhetorically when you repeat phrases. This is the true here. Instead of the beginning of the clause, though, here we have the end of the clause. So we've got our chiefs are killed. So simple clause, very simple clause, and ending with are killed. So verb, and the verb, you'll see the verb changes, and you'll see the object of this clause change, but it's the same idea. It's the same meaning. So our chiefs are killed. Looking Glass is dead. Tahulhul Shoot is dead. The old men are all dead. And then we've got a little bit further down, we've got he who led on the young men is dead. So there's the repetition of the end of a clause, not necessarily the start, which is what we saw before, but it works beautifully and poignantly. Okay, anecdote. This is quite interesting. Before I talk about this specific one, anecdotes work for quite a few creating and presenting tasks. When we can think of some kind of story or narrative example that's a very short story, which is related to a single moment, usually one or two main characters. There's something about this which seems to provide persuasive appeal in quite a few different text types. So you can use it also in magazine or feature articles. You can use it in blogs or reflective pieces. And here it works beautifully for a speech. It works beautifully for a speech. And there's something about it. There's something about telling a story. We've done it ever since we could form language. We've told stories. You look at the mythos of all kinds of primitive cultures. You look at the oral tradition of the Jewish people. You look at the way that we have told mythological stories about the creation of the universe. There's something about a story and what it means to be, it relates to what it means to be human. This is what we do. Whoops. Okay, you can see there that my kids have got swimming soon. And we've got to use this, I think, with a speech. This works. And I hope that you remember, not only for creating and presenting, but whenever you're asked to stand up in front of someone, stand up in front of a group, wherever it may be, please remember that if you want to capture their hearts, then you tell a story. So here we have Wiesel's story. He begins, this is right near the start of his acceptance speech, and he begins it telling a story of a young Jewish boy and the circumstances at the beginning of his Holocaust experience. And then some key images from those, which is here. And then he sets himself up a question, which is quite lovely here. So what have you done with my future? So this is the young Jewish boy is him. And he's pretending as though this young Jewish boy is speaking to his older self and asking his older self, what have you done with your life? So this is the way he tells the story, and then he finishes that anecdote with this key question. And then right near the end of his acceptance speech, he comes back to that anecdote and he actually provides an answer to the question that he set up at the start. So this is where he says, "This is what I say to the young Jewish boy, wondering what I have done with his years." So he goes back to the anecdote that he sets up for himself at the start. This is a really cool technique. So what you can do with your speech is begin with an anecdote. At the end of your anecdote, ask a key question that could or probably should relate to the prompt, and then come back to it right near the end of your speech after you've built up some pathos. Imagery is also a key technique, and imagery causes the audience to, as you would imagine, I've just used the word again, but imagine or visualize an illustration that you're painting with words. So when Chief Joseph here talks about the little children that are freezing to death, and that his people have run away and have no blankets, no food, and that they are perhaps freezing to death, we imagine especially little children with no blankets who are hungry and they're cold. That is quite a potent mental image that Chief Joseph has given us in this speech. And this is, while the last one was quite, this one was quite sad, so it's used to convey a poignant melancholy. Martin Luther King's one is really buoyant and optimistic, and this is probably one of the most famous images from a speech. And where he does this quite a bit in this speech, he looks forward. When he says, "I have a dream," and when he's saying, "I have a dream," he's repeating this phrase. He is explaining or illustrating what that dream might look like. And when he's doing that, he obviously must use imagery to portray what that dream looks like. This is how we have dreams ourselves, don't we? We see images. So here we've got the image of the dream, highly symbolic, where he says, "One day, right there in Alabama, specifically chosen that state, little black boys and black girls will be able to hold hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. Really potent image of unity and racial harmony. So we've got symbolism as well. Symbolism works in an interesting way. It can be used in isolation to portray, key symbols isolated symbols. But what's interesting about Paul Keating's speech, and you can do this as well, is he sets up a symbol as the core of his speech. So his speech is about the memorial to the unknown soldier. The soldier is symbolic of all the, I want to say young men and women who have died overseas, and specifically soldiers who die and we don't know where their bodies are, because we have the names of the other soldiers, and sometimes we have the bodies of the other soldiers at the memorial, but sometimes we don't get those. So this is specifically for soldiers who we don't know many of their details. And then he sets up the symbol, and then he explores it, and he explains it for the Australian people using quite a lot of repetition and some lovely rhetoric. So I think in symbols in this way, you probably call them more motifs than symbols, where the symbol is used concurrently or consistently throughout the piece and is referenced throughout the piece. Inclusive language is also really, really useful in speeches. The great thing about inclusive language, when the speaker includes the audience in on the command or on the appeal, it really gives us a great sense of, as an audience, gives us a sense of belonging and camaraderie, like kind of we're all in this together kind of feel. So this is the unknown soldier again, where we're asked to acknowledge that this is the unknown soldier, is all of those people who were just described, and therefore he is one of us, the Australian people. Inclusive language as well. So here we have the appeal for, I think this is Churchill, we cannot walk alone, and as we walk we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. So we get the sense of, we're all in this together. It's not just the speaker telling us what to do. Okay, last of all, emotive language. Emotive language, when things are worded strongly, when things are given a potency of language, they are far more interesting to listen to and far more powerful than if we simply use boring phrases. So here we can see Martin Luther King say that there is so much injustice, there is suffering. He uses the words victims, hunger, racism, persecution, prisoners, violated, oppressed. So it's like there's this word bank of key words that relate to this idea, and he's drawn all the most powerful uses of those words together, and the impact of those is almost this barrage of powerful language, and it's hard not to relent underneath it, which is pretty cool. Okay, I think that's all I have for the key structures and features of speeches. I highly recommend that if you want to look at this further, that you go back to, so maybe pick your favourite from these 5 and go back to the, go to YouTube and Google that, and you actually be able to hear everyone apart from Chief Joseph. You won't be able to hear him. But all the other ones, you'll actually be able to hear them speak, and it's really, really cool and powerful, so it's cool to take notes. And when you listen to them, mimic what they do. Mimic the kinds of things that they do at the times within the speech, and mimic the style of language that they use as well. Okay. Good luck and God bless.